Hi, in this video, I'll argue that Islam is probably true prima facie, given two hypotheses which I will expound later on. So it is an evidential argument for why Islam is probably true. And what that means is, based on what we know right now, the background evidence and observations available, it's more rational to believe that Muhammad was divinely commissioned than to believe he wasn't. Don't conflate it with numerical probabilities, which isn't at play here. Now, the structure of the argument is built on Paul Draper's epistemic probability framework, who is a well-known American philosopher, which basically says this. If some observation is less surprising on one hypothesis than on another, then that hypothesis is more probable, all else being equal. So here's the core syllogism for why Islam is probably true. If observation O is less surprising on HDC than on NC, then HDC better explains O. Observation O is in fact less surprising on HDC than NC. Therefore, HDC is the better explanation of O, and thus prima facie, as Islam is probably true. Modus ponens. Now, what's HDC? It's the hypothesis of divine commission, the idea that Muhammad was sent by God for salvific purposes. NC is the non-commission view, that he wasn't. He could be a fraud, could be sincere but mistaken, or maybe there's no God at all, doesn't matter. And to break it down, there are three observation reports, O1 to O3, real-world, historical, and cultural phenomena, which I will argue are all better explained under HDC than NC. But before I jump into those, let me explain the epistemic framework using a super simple example from the paper, An Evidential Argument for Islamic Theism by Zain Al. The Zaid and coffee example. You're not sure if your friend Zaid drinks coffee at home. Two hypotheses. A. Zaid drinks coffee at home. B. Zaid doesn't. Then you walk into his kitchen, you see a bag of coffee beans and a coffee machine. That's the observation. Now look, you don't need to know exact numerical probabilities. Intuitively, the observation is less surprising if A is true. If he drinks coffee, he will have beans and a machine. But if he doesn't, that's weird. Why does he have that stuff? So A better explains the observation than B. Therefore, A is prima facie more likely to be true. Same logic applies to this argument for Islam. The observation report here in the context of HDC and NC consists of three parts which, in conjunction, are comparatively likely under HDC than NC. O1. Muhammad precipitated a unified mass movement. Arabia in the 7th century had many difficulties. Tribal wars, religious conflicts, no centralized power. And people tried to unify it. Even according to non-Muslim sources like Ceballos, a 7th century Christian bishop. He says that the Jews even appealed to the Arabs for a religious political alliance, but couldn't unify them because of their vast amount of differences. Then came Muhammad, a merchant, and suddenly all these fractured tribes united under the authority of a single man, under a single law, and turned to the God of Abraham. Now that's already spectacular, but this depicts Muhammad's success as relatively smooth, which we shouldn't assume. Even when Muhammad arrived in Medina, he wasn't the ruler. As Montgomery Watt notes, he was one of many tribal leaders just referred to in the Constitution of Medina as someone to settle disputes. He departed from Mecca to Medina to seek refuge from severe persecution and severe hostility he faced. After all, he was just an outsider. So here's the thing. It would be really surprising if a persecuted outsider like Muhammad, with zero military backing at the start, managed to unify a deeply divided people without any kind of divine backing. But under HDC, that's exactly what you'd expect. If someone was divinely commissioned, they'd be empowered to overcome massive religious and political barriers because he can influence minds and hearts. So O1 is way less surprising under HDC. O2. The Quran enriched and transformed the Arabic language before Islam. Arabic wasn't a literary language. It was mostly oral poetry. Then the Quran was revealed and suddenly Arabic becomes a written, contemplative, theological vehicle. That's a cultural shift. The Quran deepened Arabic poetry, and hermeneutics William Graham and Naveed Kermani write that the Quran liberated Arabic poetry from the narrow framework of existing genres and inspired new approaches to language, imagery, and motifs. Alexander Nish even says it triggered a civilizational switch from a culture of intuition and improvisation to one of study and contemplation. Muhammad wasn't a poet, wasn't a scholar, wasn't formally literate, and the prevailing culture at the time was of oral transmission, not literary language. And yet he dictated the Quran over 23 years, and it became the most influential Arabic text ever. If NC is true, that's a huge surprise. If HDC is true, that checks out. God would presumably want the language of revelation to be remembered. Transforming Arabic into a literary culture aligns perfectly with that goal. O3. The Quran emphasizes moral exemplars like Joseph Surah Yusuf tells the story of Joseph from start to finish. and it's described by the Quran itself as the most beautiful of stories. But what's more important is why. Joseph represents everything that pre-Islamic Arabia wasn't. He forgives instead of seeks revenge. He's humble, patient, just. Ann Colby and William Damon say moral exemplars share 5 traits: commitment to virtue, acting on principle, self-sacrifice, inspiring others, and humility. And Joseph in the Quran exemplifies all 5. Now, in a tribal honor culture, revenge was sacred. But as Helmer Ringren notes, the Quran flips that, praising patience, endurance, and leaving vengeance to God. That kind of moral reformation is not what you expect from a tribal leader trying to secure power, but from a divine messenger trying to rewire people's moral psychology. You could plausibly assert that he would have challenged the moral norms of his time, but given that the Quran, the nature of the story of Joseph echoed in the Quran, and it perfectly aligning with all the 5 traits of a moral exemplar, that would be comparatively likier under HDC than NC. So why does this all matter? Because in each case, the observations are less surprising under the assumption that Muhammad was divinely commissioned. That's what makes the hypothesis of divine commission epistemically more probable. Prima facie. It's like Zayd in the coffee machine.